The biggest problem EVE facing at the moment is the decline in active players. Since I started playing Tranquility in June 2019, previously played on Serenity, CCP has been continuously reducing PV earnings, reducing super ratting, blackout, introducing ESS dynamic bounties, etc. The player population has been declining steadily until around October 2022 when CCP reluctantly adjusted the lowest rate back to 100%, reduced manufacturing material requirements, and introduced heavy discounts on PLEX to barely halt the population decline. During this process, a more severe consequence was the disappearance of numerous small core and alliances, leading to the relative strengthening of large alliances and turning countless null SEC regions into deserted areas. This further deteriorated the PvP environment, making game contents harder to find. On the other hand, large-scale battles with thousands of players increased relatively, and the server became the determining factor for victory or defeat. Many people complain that game updates are too slow and there is too little new content, which undoubtedly is one of the reasons for player attrition, but not the main one. The content introduced by the game operators in 1 to 2 years may be played out by players in just half a month. Frequent additions of ships and contents make the game overly complex and also contribute to discouraging new players. Ultimately, the problem lies in the low risk-reward ratio for new player to PvE, combined with the vast wealth disparity between new and veteran players. So why does CCP keep reducing PvE earnings, cutting off its own source of revenue? This brings us to another important issue: in-game asset inflation. In-game asset inflation and the wealth disparity among players are challenging problems that a free market economy MMO cannot escape. Let's first discuss the problems caused by in-game asset inflation and wealth disparity. Game asset inflation: imagine in most free market games, where a large number of players continue to produce while consumption remains minimal. This will inevitably lead to inflation within the game, causing devaluation of in-game assets when exchanged for real currency. Consequently, PvE earnings decrease significantly, reducing the appeal of PvE and causing players to leave. Wealth disparity: experienced veteran players who are wealthy and have high skill levels spend less, resulting in less revenue for the operators, while new players must pay a higher cost to catch up to the veterans. More people will choose to play new games, resulting in fewer fresh players entering the game. The experience for veteran players will deteriorate, and the operators' reduced income will lead to fewer updates or server maintenance, forming a vicious cycle. Typical solutions in Chinese online games generally involve 3 points. 1. Opening new servers. 2. Merging old servers into Season 2. Achievements in production or PvP within the game provide rewards based on rankings, while other progress is reset. Paying in Season 1 and carrying over to Season 2 would lead to significant devaluation, essentially allowing everyone to start on an equal footing and continue forcing you to pay more or to rat more. 3. Directly increasing PvE rewards, resulting in a significant devaluation of existing equipment and assets. This approach ensures that the gap between veteran and new players is not too large, and it facilitates attracting new players to continue grinding. For example, previously, it took 100 hours of PvE to produce a sword with 100 DPS, whereas now, in the same time frame, a weapon with 1000 DPS is produced. Of course, the game operator cannot directly change the data in this manner, but there would be various modifications, and the essence remains the same. Compared to these games, EVE has much stricter economic balance. Sometimes the CCP would rather offend players and reduce income in order to balance the economy, such as blackout, industry reform, ESS bounty multiplier. Regardless of the outcome, whether it is a good or bad move, the original intention of the developers is indeed to balance the economy and extend the lifespan of the game, even at the cost of short-term gains. This aspect is commendable. However, these methods ultimately only address the symptoms and fail to solve the entropy increase problem in the free market. Here, I introduce a concept from the second law of thermodynamics, which is a theory I have developed myself within real-world economic systems. In an isolated system, we can view the global or national free market economy as an isolated system. Without government intervention, over time, the wealth gap will continue to widen, and this process cannot be spontaneously reversed without external forces. Of course, this theory certainly has many loopholes, but using it as a rough analogy to help us understand the free market economy is not wrong. For example, when the government increases taxes on the rich to transfer payments, which are external forces, the wealth gap decreases or the rate of expansion diminishes, but it will inevitably have a negative impact on short-term economic growth, maybe also impact on long-terms, depend on how much it levies. When the rich are taxed less or when taxes on corporations are reduced, there will be short-term positive effects on economic growth, but in the long run, negative effects is widening wealth gap. I just wanted to illustrate that it has long been proven that external interventions in isolated systems can reverse the wealth disparity in EVE, such as the distance between new and veteran players or the power gap between large and small alliances. I will discuss this in detail later. The second issue is in-game asset inflation, which is simple to understand without providing examples. Every month, EVE's in-game economic reports show that the production of resources far exceeds consumption. Despite the efforts of the CCP to encourage more PvP activities, the result is that when production is reduced, the number of players also decreases significantly. Whether it is Blackout or ESS, it is already apparent, the number of PvE players need to increase, then the number of PvP players would increase. When the supply at the bottom of the food chain decreases, PvP players naturally decrease. Once the number of players falls below a certain threshold, a vicious cycle ensues. For example, the current high in-game price of Plex discourages PvE players, especially new players. The fact that it may not be very noticeable is because the CCP is heavily discounting the price. Due to unprecedented discounts on 1-year and 2-year subscriptions, we can see that CCP's profits will decrease significantly in the future, and they might even incur losses. This is not sustainable. Since EVE is already a punishing game, PvP activities themselves consume a large amount of resources, and there are also many AFK players who hoard large produced resources. Although some AFK players will return eventually, the overall number of AFK players increases each month. This is also one of the important reasons why the CCP strictly prohibits real money trading. Otherwise, AFK players would sell all their resources and characters to new players, leading to rampant inflation. Fortunately, EVE has a control group to compare with, which is Serenity, where 500 Plex is approximately 7 billion ISK. What I want to say is that inflation is a problem for EVE, but not the most severe one. If it is caused by uneven distribution, then the harm is greatest. There are mainly 3 factors. Risks from people huddling together are not proportional to income. Risks from multiboxing are not proportional to income. Risks and rewards from having and not having resources are not proportional. First, let's simplify the inflation standard to the price of ISK per Plex, specifically the price of 500 Plex. The price is primarily influenced by the demand and supply of Plex, with the supply being determined by paying players. In the long term, PvP players are the long-term Plex suppliers, while PvE players are often the long-term Plex demanders. Thus, the equation becomes Plex price equal ISK supply divide Plex supply, ignoring short-term factors such as liquidity. Let's consider an equilibrium scenario. If the Plex in-game price increases, PvE players decrease, unable to afford monthly subscriptions, but ISK becomes cheaper in the short term, there will be more players selling Plex, increasing the supply and causing the Plex price to decrease. As a result, more PvE players return to purchase PLEX due to the lower prices. This represents a short-term equilibrium, where PvP players dominate at high prices because selling Plex is profitable, while PvE players dominate at low prices because it's easier to earn monthly subscriptions through production, leading to more players participating. However, if the in-game Plex price continues to rise in the long term, let's say for a year, there must be some internal reasons for the sustained increase. In EVE, there is an important concept: the lower in-game Plex price, the more PvE and PvP players there are. Low in-game Plex price reflect the vibrancy of EVE, but they are an indicator, not the cause. The short-term equilibrium is expected to persist, so why is it disrupted? It must be due to fundamental factors or problems with the system itself. In the case of EVE, it could be either issues with the game content itself, such as updates, or income imbalance. Let's examine a simple model and 2 cases. Initially, there are 1,000 PvE players dispersed across 1,000 star systems, corresponding to 1,000 PvP players. Each player has the same production efficiency and faces the same risks. PvE players do not attack each other, and PvP players do not attack each other to simplify the model. After 1 month, due to factors such as information exchange and allying, 900 players are engaged in production across 900 star systems, while 100 players form clusters in 10 star systems. Although the production efficiency of clustered players decreases, their losses are significantly reduced, and the overall efficiency remains the same. Many smart solo PvP players simply avoid those 10 clustered star systems to minimize their losses. As time passes, more PvP players choose to avoid those 10 star systems, and an increasing number of PvE players opt for clustering, resulting in fewer solo production players shouldering more risks and experiencing declining efficiency. Unfortunately, in-game Plex price increases, and the decreased output from clustering behavior is minimal, or may even increase. However, the frequency of PvP decreases, leading to a sharp decline in resource consumption. Solo PvP players find it increasingly challenging to engage solo PvE players. Eventually, many PvE players who dislike clustering become bankrupt and leave the game, while PvP players begin to form groups to attack clustered players. PvP players who dislike clustering also leave the game. In response, production players cluster even tighter, and only 500 PvE players remain in a large group, while 500 PvP players also form a large group. Of course, the actual situation is not as simple as the model, but in reality, it is even more extreme. One fish pond can attract multiple pirate groups to fight each other. As a former FC of a corporation and a small alliance, the highest probability of engaging in PvP battles was around caught PvE ships. In prepared situations, the side with a higher probability of being outnumbered tends to abandon the fight, resulting in a waste of time for many players gathering for the battle. The second case is multiple accounts for efficient and low-risk gameplay. Let's say someone runs 7 Ishtar accounts for ratting, earning 50 million ISK per hour per account, and each ship is worth 200 million ISK. Since all accounts can easily avoid hostile encounters, I personally did this in Declane for about 3 months and even made a video with over 41,000 views, which you probably have seen if you are a Chinese player. Without considering the cost of time, the break-even point is a little over half an hour. In other words, if I don't lose a ship within 40 minutes, I won't be at a loss. How much does a monthly subscription cost? Let's assume it's 2 billion ISK. In reality, I have never spent more than 1.5 billion ISK on a month's subscription, usually ranging from 1 billion to 1.3 billion ISK, buying discounted Plex or when the price was low. I usually buy a year's subscription at once, which amounts to 14 billion ISK for 7,500 PLEX. At 350 million ISK per hour, without losing ships, it takes 40 hours to earn 7,500 PLEX. Moreover, the monthly subscription is not entirely consumed since it includes nearly 2 million skill points, which are worth approximately 1.6 billion ISK. In practice, I lose a ship once a week, playing for 4 hours a day. With this schedule, I lose a ship every 28 hours, and the risk can be considered negligible. If I were to play solo for 4 hours a day, I would need to play without losing a ship for 4 hours every day for 10 days just to cover the cost of a monthly subscription. Clearly, the difficulties are overwhelming. Later, I taught my wife how to run the Burning Mission 7 Tunes multi-boxing for 2 hours, earning at least 2 billion ISK. Once proficient, pretty much after a week, she could even watch movies on the other screen, and the probability of losing a ship was even lower than once a week. In reality, I'm not in a rush to sell the LP. I wait for prices to rise before selling, and the individual earnings are much higher than 2 billion ISK. Currently, prices range from 2.5 billion to 3 billion ISK. We also made a video with 27,000 views. Now, many players run 5 accounts for Thunder Child farming, earning approximately 3 minutes per heaven site. A small number of players with high income have impacted the price of in-game Plex, leading to higher risks and in-game subscription prices for newcomers who play solo. 3. High profits for producers. This phenomenon may not be as evident in EVE as it is in reality, but since the manufacturing reform, many long-term holders have become rich overnight. Another factor is earning significant price differences through Plex and official events. In the last Extractor event, I purchased nearly 900 Brainless at a cost of approximately 140 million each. A few days later, I sold them for a profit of nearly 140 million ISK per unit, making a risk-free profit of nearly 120 billion ISK in just a few hours. The profit comes from the official discounts, which severely erode the future purchases of extractors by players from the official store. If every player can profit from it, it would make the game more vibrant. However, individuals with substantial capital take away the majority of the profit. I know a Chinese player who has stockpiled at least 10,000 extractors. These are just a few examples I have experienced or seen, and there are certainly other examples I am not aware of. I won't elaborate further on this, but feel free to discuss it in the comments below. In summary, anyone with some knowledge of economics knows that the classical liberal economic system declared bankruptcy during the Great Depression in 1929. The flaws in that system are precisely the enormous problems EVE is currently facing, with the polarization of new and veteran players due to inflation. In reality, economic and technological development leads to an increase in the wealth gap. This is an inherent attribute of a free market economy that cannot be eliminated. The larger the wealth gap, the weaker the economic vitality. The expansion process is a byproduct of economic growth, and it must be artificially eliminated through government transfer payments for the system to continue functioning. In the game, the operator adjusts the game content to regulate it, such as cutting off the flashpoint in Pochven, blackouts, manufacturing reforms, bounty multipliers, but these changes have actually kicked out the players who need protection the most, the players who have survived the high elimination rate in the early stages. They are the players who add vitality to the game and should be the ones to survive. In fact, it would be better to increase PV income in the game, allowing new players to grow quickly, and increase high-risk, high-reward PvE activities, such as Flashpoint. This not only increases the income for PvE players but also adds contents for PvP players. However, this short-term prosperity would accelerate inflation, just like high inflation rates in reality, and interest rate hikes would be necessary to control it. The ones most affected would be the young people who have just improved their living conditions and bought houses, and also they are the future drivers of the economy. Their monthly payments would increase while their jobs disappear. Returning to the game, are there any existing activities in EVE that allow PvE players to earn a significant amount of ISK without causing inflation? Yes, there are. Limited time booster events. How did I come up with this idea? It's related to my PvP habits. I always like to use a bunch of boosters during fights, and every time I engage in combat, regardless of whether it has a fight or not, a 500 million ISK was gone. Looking at how expensive these limited time boosters are on the market, it's evident that they are highly sought after by PvP players. These limited time boosters have a unique characteristic: they expire and become ineffective. In other words, the batch of boosters produced by PvE participation becomes worthless once they expire, ensuring that they do not cause permanent inflation. Here comes the key point. So, let's expand our thinking. If every output has a time limit, wouldn't there be no perpetual inflation? Of course, no one would want to play under such circumstances. So, let's find a solution from the real world and combine the two. Developed countries almost always have property taxes. From an economic perspective, if the property tax is 1%, then the value of your house would only last for 100 years before becoming zero. The consumption rate would be 1% per year, ignoring maintenance costs, regardless of appreciation or depreciation. If each Titan had to pay a monthly maintenance fee of 1% of its valuation, then theoretically, the economic lifespan of that Titan would be only 100 months. The ore mined 100 months ago would basically be gone by then. This way, there would be no long-term inflation. Some may ask what would happen if they didn't pay the bill. In that case, the ship's performance parameters could be reduced. However, how do we balance it for AFK players, since it would be unfair to them? My proposal is to fix the storage time for resources, for example, 6 months, which would significantly reduce maintenance costs, and so on. If the cost is too high and it affects player motivation, then the rates can be lowered. There will always be a balance point where player acceptance and economic equilibrium can be achieved. Furthermore, we can discuss whether this should apply only to super capital ships or all ships, or whether equipment should also require maintenance. It is a matter of details, and CCP can gradually test and implement adjustments. Now let's talk about the benefits of such an approach. Keeping the total inventory at a low level, so that political wars can ultimately impact the market, unlike the current situation. This is one of the charms of EVE, as stated in EVE's YouTube advertisements. With resources at a low inventory level, the choice of standardized PvP fittings would have a greater sense of hierarchy. In the current large-scale sovereignty wars, the primary consideration is the combat power of the ships, followed by cost-effectiveness, and finally strategic reserves. The X-47 battle consumed a total of 1 trillion ISK, with each alliance only having to SRP around 100 billion-200 billion. Keep in mind that there are thousands of players whose net worth exceeds 1 trillion. How many times do we need to have such battles to truly make war a fierce attrition? If the market inventory of a particular ship is low and the alliance only considers combat power without taking into account the marginal cost, because the server has a limited supply, if one alliance buys half of it, the price could more than double. If maintenance fees are introduced, the Doctrine Caracal Moa may become back, the Hurricane and Drake may become mainstream. Faction battleships ECT would become true elite fleet. With significantly increased consumption, the production efficiency per unit of time would also improve, making it easier for new players who have just started. Reducing the power of mega alliances and allowing small and medium-sized alliances with lighter assets to survive, thus increasing the diversity in the universe. Let's discuss only introducing maintenance fees for super capital ships as a case study. In the current null SEC sovereignty alliances, most of the war losses are borne by the alliances. Once maintenance fees are increased, due to heavy asset operations, their proportion of maintenance costs will be higher than that of light asset alliances. This will inevitably affect the distribution of war expenses. Players will bear a higher proportion of a war costs, whether it is ship maintenance fees or ship losses. This will certainly impact the attendance rate of mega alliances. Currently, there are often thousands of players fighting in one system, but they can only fire a few shots in an hour, which makes the PvP experience extremely poor. Once the number of players in mega alliances decreases, the remaining players who truly want to participate in large-scale battles will have a better experience. In fact, increasing players' own losses will make the entire war more meaningful and immersive. Light asset alliances may increase the proportion of SRP to attract relatively passive PvP players. Heavy PvP alliances can focus more on finding PvP content. In fact, due to the increase in holding costs, the prices of ships themselves will inevitably decrease. Heavy PvP alliances, with short asset holding cycles and easy to be destroyed, where players bear the losses for the enjoyment of PvP, will actually decrease the overall cost of PvP, resulting in more players would come, which is more conducive to raiding mega alliances and creating more PvP content. There may also be some extreme passive PvP players who are purely focused on production and manufacturing. They can form unarmed alliances with the lowest cost, and they can hire heavy PvP alliances or join mega alliances to survive. This would enhance the diversity of the universe and create a positive cycle for EVE. In summary, introducing asset maintenance fees can solve the problem of inflation. CCP can introduce more high-risk, high-reward projects like lucrative flashpoints to increase PvP content. It would also reduce the strength of mega alliances, increase trade volume due to low inventory. Then war will affect the market, increase overall consumption within the game, not just in terms of maintenance fees, and trigger a chain reaction that increases both the quantity and quality of PvP. This would lead to higher PvE profits, reducing the gap between new and veteran players and making it easier for newbies to survive and thrive. Progressive income tax, targeting multi-boxing players and high-income players. This is very easy to understand, just like the income tax in developed countries. The specific implementation can be divided into two sets of plans. Collected by NPCs, such as the Concord, which would apply to all players. Let's ignore the technical matter for now. In principle, income can be reduced by expenses, such as ship losses, even monthly subscription fees, skill injection costs, etc. The remaining net income can be subject to taxation. If it is technically feasible, all income from all characters of an individual player can be collectively taxed. If not, taxation can be applied to the main sources of income for each individual character, such as bounties and LP points. For example, let's take the example of null SEC bounty ratting. A player who has been playing EVE for a year and has 3 accounts with yearly subscriptions spends 3 hours a day ratting and participates in PvP 10 times a month, with losses of 500 million ISK and 5 ratting ships worth 1 billion ISK. The total monthly income is 13.5 billion ISK, and after purchasing 10 skill injectors to learn alliance doctrines, the remaining net income is 3 billion ISK. If we deduct the monthly subscription fee of 6 to 7 billion ISK, the taxable amount would be negative. Regardless of the threshold for exemption, most normal players within 2 years of playing would likely not be subject to taxation. As a comparison, let me give another example of my wife. She multi-boxes in Running Burner mission, spending 2 hours a day, with an average income of 2.5 billion ISK, which amounts to 75 billion per month. Her losses do not exceed 1 billion on average, usually less than 500 million. If we assume losses of 1 billion, and since all her characters have over 100 million skill points, she doesn't need to buy skill injectors. After deducting monthly subscriptions 2.5 billion ISK per account multiplied by 7 accounts, let's assume 17.5 billion, although I actually purchased discounted yearly subscriptions at a much lower price. Even if her PvP losses are 10 billion ISK per month, the net income for each of her account is 6.78 billion ISK. If the exemption threshold is set at 3 billion ISK, then a significant amount of taxes would be levied on her 7 accounts. What if she spent 4 hours a day running Burner with 2 fleets simultaneously? I know a Korean player who runs 2 fleets 12 accounts with dual screens and accumulates enough wealth to own a faction titan within a few months. Once income tax is introduced, such high-intensity PvE activities will be significantly reduced. Players engaging in such activities would occupy resources that should be allocated to 10 or even 100 new players because the invisible hand of the market is at work. Each PvE activity should correspondingly generate PvP activities of relative economic value. If it's not, it will inevitably squeeze the space of other players, and the most tangible effect would be the rise in Plex prices. This has been discussed in detail before. Of course, this is an issue with the economic system and has nothing to do with individual player morals. In summary, introducing income tax would significantly suppress high-intensity, high-income, low-risk PvE activities and encourage PvP from a basic economic perspective. I believe the effect would be better than CCP deliberately strengthening PvP through game design, such as the faction warfare. I'm not saying this revamp is bad. Personally, I think it's quite good. The positive aspect is that it concentrates the population in low security space. However, the downside is that the overall population that can be sustained is decreasing. It's like cutting off 80% of the solar systems, only addressing surface-level short-term issues. The introduction of filaments and changes to jump bridges undoubtedly accelerate the pace of overall PvP, but the total population has decreased, which is equivalent to cutting off many solar systems. In summary, to create a healthy game cycle, the PvP experience must be strengthened. PvP population needs to be increased, and to increase the PvP population, PvE population must be increased. To increase the PvE population, PvE rewards need to be improved, ensuring that the majority of rewards are not accumulated by a minority. The rewards should be fairer, with high risk corresponding to high rewards and low risk corresponding to low rewards, thus increasing PvP activities resulting from PvE behaviors. 2. Collected by player corporations and implemented through progressive tax rates set by the player corporation's authority. Since humans are inherently resistant to accepting new things, it is difficult for me to predict the actual effects of this change, as it is a result of player interaction. However, if a corporation benefits and expands through such a tax reform, then soon the majority of corporations will follow suit. The specific manifestation would be that the tax rates for most players would decrease, while a small number of players would contribute the majority of the tax revenue. It is difficult to imagine what kind of equilibrium this would eventually form. Compared to the previous strategy, the summary is as follows. Advantages: handing over power to corporations may make the entire universe's corporation ecosystem more diverse. Corporations are the foundation of EVE's population, just as companies are the basis of the modern real-world economy. The reason why CCP has discounted and reverted null SEC income but the population has not significantly increased could be explained by the disappearance of many corporation alliances, which takes time to recover. Disadvantages: expenses cannot be deducted, reducing the incentivizing effect for PvP and suppressing the rapid growth of certain newcomers. Summary for all: the real-world economy has already provided a positive template for EVE, while Serenity serves as a negative control group for Tranquility. Perhaps my argument is full of loopholes, but this is definitely a feasible approach. If the issues of numerical inflation and wealth inequality are not addressed from an economic perspective, then it is recommended to set a limited operating period for the server, such as a 10-year cycle, and reset the data to 0 and start over. This would be similar to historical examples where violent upheaval and a restart occurred due to the Malthusian trap. If you agree with my concept, please click like and actively share it to let more people see it. Perhaps it can truly drive CCP to change the game mechanics.